Hey, you're listening to the Citizen Coder Podcast. In this episode, I talk to Brooklin Myers, a developer and teacher of the Elixir programming language. We talk about finding a job in tech, functional programming, building an Elixir Academy, I forget how to say Anecdotal, and so much more. Let's dive in. Hey, so why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Brooklin Myers. I'm the Elixir instructor at DockYard Academy, and I'm also the host of the Elixir Newbie podcast.
So what kind of got you into podcasting?
That's a really good question. A lot of random choices and circumstances. It all started with a sabbatical. So if anyone is considering a sabbatical, I highly recommend it. So sabbatical, basically taking a few months off of work to either do a big trip or just take the time off, kind of think about what you want to keep doing with your life. And it was just this time where I had this opportunity to take some time off, and I was kind of half enjoying my development work. I was working in I was MERN stack, so Mongo, Express, React Native, and Node,
Okay.
and I was just having these feelings in my job of like, hey, like this is fun. I love development, but there's just something off. Like something's not quite right. And I didn't know exactly what it was. So fortunately, I had this awesome opportunity to just take some time off, think about what I wanted to do. When I say sabbatical, for me, it was kind of like a diet quitting.
Oh yeah, sure.
Where yeah, it was like I know that I want to leave, but I want the security of being able to come back. So I'm going to call this
Yeah.
a sabbatical, but I think everyone knows that I'm really just leaving.
I took a sabbatical
Um,
once. It was really just a big layoff.
there you go. Yeah.
A forced
Yeah. And
sabbatical.
so, exactly. And during that time, I started to reflect on like, hey, what is it that I really enjoyed doing? And I started to realize, oh man, it's teaching. Like the parts of development that I enjoy the most are when you have a junior dev join your team and you need to help them onboard, or you need to, supervise a couple of developers on a feature, or and I just started realizing more and more that completing a ticket work, while I really do enjoy that, I needed more teaching and education in my life, and that is the stuff that I'm the most passionate about. And so I had all this free time, so I started writing. I started writing about Elixir, which was this kind of programming language that at the time I was just starting to be interested in, and writing was a way to learn more about it. And then as I started writing more, and that started picking up some popularity, I was like, hey, why not try a podcast? It really was that simple. It wasn't this big, like, I'm going to start a podcast. It's going to, be this big thing, and I'm going to put all this effort into it, and it's going to be super successful. It really just was like, I'm going to record myself talking into a microphone for an hour and see what happens. And I showed my friends that first recording, and they said, well, it wasn't bad, but it was terrible. Um,
Yeah, I tried that a few
and
times.
and so the first one, it was a bit of a throwaway. It was like, okay, learning experience, and I took the feedback. And then the next one I recorded was better. It was publishable, and I just kept kind of walking through the steps of building out a podcast, learning how to host it, learning how to deploy it on the different platforms, um, and I just put the episode out, and then I just kind of kept doing that. And then at some point, that started helping me get kind of attention within the Elixir community, um, and that led to where I am now. So yeah, it was not some big thought out thing. It was just, I really want to try this form of content creation. I already know I enjoy writing. Maybe I'll enjoy speaking. I'm sure within the span of this podcast, you'll learn that I like talking a lot. Um, and
Nothing wrong
so
with
yeah,
talking.
it was just an experiment that continued to go well.
So how did you wind up programming? Like, what was your kind of journey to that point to actually start programming?
Yeah, it's really funny. I got into it kind of post high school. So I had a kind of wild, traumatic like exit out of high school where I had this pretty major concussion. It was a compound concussion, And so all hopes and dreams of like university had kind of gone down the toilet, and I just wasn't able to like maintain grades, or
Was that
it was it.
I'm sorry, was that football related or
It's
some kind of
so weird that
sports?
you guessed that and are correct. Yeah, it was football related. It was football and wrestling related. Compound because I got it in multiple sports. Um, and yeah, I really, not to go too deep into that aspect. By the way, this sounds like it's a horrible thing. I'm actually really grateful for it. It was something that altered the trajectory of my life in a really good way. But yeah, at
Yeah,
the
sure.
time it was a huge bummer. Like, oh man, I can't go to university. This has totally altered my path. What the heck am I going to do? And um, couldn't finish the rest of the kind of football season, which was definitely a bummer at the time. And uh, graduated high school just feeling completely lost in life. Like, I started kind of working, classic minimum wage jobs, got into computer sales and repair, and that kind of got me interested in tech. And then I had a friend who, when hearing me lament my, like, I don't know what to do with my life, the classic kind of early 20s struggle, late teens, early 20s struggle that everyone has, like, what the heck am I going to do with my life?
Sure.
Was like, hey, you should try out a Udemy course. And I did, and I loved it. It was Stephen. Oh, what was it? Rob Percival's
Rob
complete web
Percival.
developer course.
That was the first
Dang,
one I ever did.
really?
Same
That's
exact
that's
one.
too funny. It's yeah, it was such a great intro into programming. And at this time, I wasn't even considering like, oh man, I love this. Like now, I'm pretty passionate about it. But at the time, I was just like, I just need to do something other than selling computers, because it was a fun job, but you kind of get used to the motions after a little while.
Yeah.
Um,
So we have a lot of parallels. So I actually, well, we don't have the high school concussion as a parallel, but uh, I actually did a lot of computer repair for a job for a while before I got into programming. It didn't necessarily. I mean, I guess it sort of led me to programming, but I ran a small computer repair business out of Charlotte, North Carolina, and wound up. I mean, we wound up moving. A lot of life stuff happened. Had a kid. Family members passed away, and I really just kind of got into it looking for a way to make money outside of um, doing computer repair work, which was kind of on a downslope, and I think it still kind of is, unless you own Macs or something like that and need those fixed.
That sounds like it would have been a pretty tumultuous transition period. But um, how are you enjoying the, like, did that transition kind of work for you? Because that's the great thing about programming, is it's so accessible, is that
It,
anyone from any background can get into it.
yeah, it really is, and I don't program for a living as of yet, but it's definitely given me uh, a lot of fun, and I've learned a lot of new stuff, and I've been able to build websites here and there. I actually had a job right before the pandemic hit. I was working for a resort, and I was rebuilding their website, and I built them an online store for their they had like a little clothing store there. So I built their online store for that, and then pandemic hit and they closed.
Ah,
I think it lasted about 6 months, and that was pretty much it.
yeah, that's it's unfortunate. A lot of things were halted in the past couple of years, that's for sure. But
Yeah, and I live
um,
in a really small area too, so there's not a lot of like tech jobs nearby.
mm,
So I'd have to pack up and move, and or find something real remote that would
mhm.
be okay with bringing somebody on board without a ton of professional dev experience.
Man, I literally could and have had entire conversations about just getting your first developer job. Um, I know we have a lot that we want to talk about, but I would love to kind of talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
Um, Getting your first job is so hard, which I say as someone who really wants people to get into programming. Like, I don't mean to say that in a discouraging way. It's
No.
the hardest part by far. Like, once you have your first job, you now have your hands on the ladder and you can keep climbing. But the first rung of the ladder is so high that it can be really difficult to get enough of a foundation to be hireable, to meet the people that you need to. If you go about it kind of the classic ways, which are, let's say, job forums, which I'm really, I'm not against using job forums, but I think there are better ways to find work that a lot of people don't take advantage of when they're looking for their first job. Um, and so it can be this like very discouraging thing. A lot of people get turned away in that early cycle. I think we miss out on a lot of people who could have been really great developers if they had just um, kind of been able to get that first, get their foot in the door. Um, so if you don't mind, I'd love to talk
Sure.
a little bit about kind of what I recommend people do for getting their first job, and maybe that can be something that's interesting to you as well.
Yeah, yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So essentially, the current landscape. So you're a new developer. You haven't gotten your first professional experience. This is the metaphorical you, maybe you, the listener,
Metaphorical
and
me.
the metaphorical you. And you're considering, okay, like how do I get my first job? And kind of the classic, oh, well, I will go to a job board. I'll see jobs that are posted and I will put my resume on them and send a message saying, hey, here's why I think I'm a good fit. And rinse, wash, repeat. I'll do that 10, 20, 30 times. And the thing is, whenever you're doing that, if you are someone who does not have lots of resume experience, you're competing on your weaknesses rather than competing on your strengths, right? So you're competing with other people who have professional experience or who
Hmm.
have a bigger resume. And even if you would have been a great personality fit, your attitude was way better than the person that you're competing with, this pretend person that has more experience. You would have learned on the job and been able to produce quickly. You would have been an absolute, sponge for knowledge because you have that. Like, I haven't worked yet, so whatever patterns and practices. Like, junior developers are awesome because they are generally unopinionated and they
Hmm.
will be quick to pick up the habits and practices of the team. Whereas you can have some very experienced senior developers come on and they have very strong opinions. So you can spend a lot more of your time debating what the right way is rather than just moving forward and making progress. Um,
Yeah, that
and
makes
so
a lot of
that's
sense.
yeah, and so that's where a lot of people get discouraged is they have to, you hear stories of like, oh, just send out 100 job applications and eventually you'll find the right one. I'm like, if you do something 100 times and it's not working, stop. Like, that's the definition of insanity, right? Is repeating the
Right.
same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. It's like the world is trying to tell you that you're doing something incorrectly when you continuously experience negative feedback. So if
Sure.
that's the place that you're in, if that is not working, there's two paths forward. Either you need to figure out how to compete on experience and get this like really impressive looking resume, which is going to be really hard if you don't have professional experience, or you compete on your strengths. And your strengths as a junior are your personability, your like talking and people skills, your enthusiasm, basically
Hmm.
everything that you can't put into a resume, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so as a junior, and a new dev, in my opinion, the best way to find opportunities is to meet with these people directly as much as possible. It doesn't have to be in person because I know the past 2 years have been pretty hard for that, although it is starting to be more possible. When I say directly, I mean like what I often recommend to people is find companies that you're interested in working for. On sites like LinkedIn, find companies that have the technical stack that you're interested in, and then find people who work for that company and reach out. And don't reach out saying, hey, please give me a job, because everyone is going to be kind of deterred by that. That's kind of
yeah.
off-putting. It's more of a, hey, I'm a new dev. I've been trying to work and learn in order to get the skills I need to like be hired. Um, I was really curious, if you don't mind me asking, what's your experience working at company XYZ like? Right. And I'm not asking for anything.
Yeah,
If you don't mind, I'm being polite, like you don't have to.
sure.
And the goal of that, there's kind of multiple goals to that. The first goal is so hiring is hard. Even if you make it through the process, most hiring cycles are about 3 weeks, kind of minimum. You're going to have multiple different meetings. And if you ask that person, hey, what's it like? And they say, like, it's okay, which is probably the worst thing that anyone would say online about their own company.
Right.
That means it's terrible and you should not waste your time interviewing for that company, because you were about to spend, even if you made it through the process, that could have been 3 to 6 weeks, depending on their cycle, that you just spent wasted on
A
trying
company
to get a
that's gonna,
company to hire you that you didn't want to work for in the first place.
yeah, a company that's not gonna be so great.
Yeah, so best way to like save time is to not spend it in the first place, right? That's the best way to go faster is to not do it.
Makes
And
sense to
so
me.
yeah, so you that's kind of your worst case scenario. Best case, they tell you information about the company, and then maybe you can ask them, hey, like, um, if things are going well and you're kind of picking their brain and getting some idea, you're basically asking them questions that you do want to know. Like, ask them about the company, what stack they're using. You might ask them, like, hey, if you've already applied for a job posting, you might say, like, hey, I have this job posting. What do you think I should prepare for? Like, what kind of things are you doing at XYZ company? That's a great question because now you can know how to kind of prepare for the interview, and know, oh, like you guys use, I don't know, you guys use a lot of, you don't use class syntax for your React components. You use a lot more like function syntax. And if you don't know function syntax, but you know class syntax, that will probably hurt you, just as a like off the cuff example. Um, and if you're as you're having this conversation, uh, things seem to be going well, then you might ask them, "Hey, I'm really you've spoken really well about this company. Um, I would love to apply. Do you know who I should speak to?" Right, and that is a
Yeah,
very low effort. You're not asking for a recommendation because again, that I think deters people.
yeah, that's
Like if I don't know you, I don't want
probably
to stick my
everybody.
neck out for you,
Right,
right?
right.
And so, but it gracefully gives you an opportunity where they might offer, right? Like, kind of worst thing, oh, sorry, I don't know. Okay,
Sure,
no
yeah.
problem. I'll go find out. Oh, yeah, it's so and so. Great. Now maybe you just skipped the queue. Now maybe your resume goes directly to the person who is responsible for hiring rather than getting pre filtered by some kind of an automated system. Like, that's great.
Oh yeah,
So that
yeah.
could have
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so that could have just saved you the hardest part as a junior, which is getting past the like, oh, your resume didn't have the one keyword, so we're going to remove it now because when you post a job thing, you get like 40 to 100 resumes and you have to do a bunch of early filtering. That's kind of unfair because you haven't met the candidates, but you just have to because how else are you going to filter? Um, and great, now maybe you skip that line. And best case scenario, this person's really impressed with your attitude. You've managed to remain polite, considerate. You haven't overextended yourself, and they are impressed by that. And they say, yeah, it's so and let me give you a referral. Because a lot of
Mm.
companies, they might just do it out of the goodness of their heart, and like that's awesome. There's lots of just nice people who would just do it because it's a good thing to do, and
Hmm.
that's awesome if that's part of their motivation. There might also be internal hiring bonuses and things like that. So this is something that people want to do. They just want to make sure that they do it with someone they can trust. So they might get a bonus if they recommend and refer you, and then now you're getting kind of the white glove treatment getting into the company, and you've skipped so many of the early filters. So yeah, that's my TLDR. I don't know how short that actually was. I think I may have talked about it for quite a while because it's something I'm pretty
No,
passionate
that's
about.
fine.
But yeah, I hope that's useful for you.
Yeah, definitely. Somebody that's kind of um sort of looked at applying. I've applied a few places, but I haven't gone like full bore trying to find something. I mean, my current job, it pays the pay's okay. It's not the greatest, but it's it pays the bills, and we aren't struggling. But I also get my job. Actually, I work 3 days a week, so I work Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and that's it.
Nice, very
So
nice.
I get 4 days off a week, and it lets me focus on side projects and family time and things like that. So it's not as like as far as that goes, it's kind of hard to beat.
Hmm.
As far as the time off goes. So I guess I haven't really put the time into trying to find something else quite yet.
Mm.
Also, um, I probably sell myself short as far as what my actual technical abilities are. Maybe there's some doubt.
Hmm.
A lot of imposter syndrome, I'm sure.
Hmm. It's everyone has it. Um, it's kind of funny you mentioned that because the sign of someone who, um, how do I put this? if someone tells me they're extremely confident in their developer abilities, I either think they're actually exceptional or very bad. Like there's very little
Hmm.
binary there,
Okay.
and that's Dunning Kruger effect. So I don't know for folks who might not be aware of Dunning Kruger effect. Essentially, the less you know about something, the more confidently you will rate yourself in your abilities. Whereas the more you know about something, the less confidently you'll rate yourself in your abilities. So I'll give a
Oh,
personal
interesting.
example. Yeah, it's an interesting effect. It's good to be aware of because it can help you self-diagnose where you're at with something. So when someone tells me that they're not super confident, I actually see that as like a really good sign. Funny enough. And so for myself, when I first started development, I had someone kind of ask me, "Hey, like, where would you rate yourself on a scale of 10 as a developer?" I'm like, "Oh, maybe about a 7, maybe about a 7, a little bit above average." And then I actually learned more about programming and real world stuff. I'm like, okay, maybe like a 5. I'm like right on the average mark. Okay,
Yeah.
maybe about a 5. And then I started to see the bigger world of programming and what's out there. And I'm like, I'm a 3.
I'm a three.
I'm a 3, maybe a 2, maybe a 2. And these days I'm like, yeah, I'm like a fraction of 1. I'm like zero point 0.5, and it has not started increasing.
That's too funny.
So I think, and obviously I haven't gotten worse, I've gotten better, but
Sure.
as your circle of knowledge expands, the circumference of what you don't know also expands as well, because you become more and more aware that
More
there is
aware,
a
right?
great number of things that you don't know.
Mm. That's that's kind of a little mind blowing for me. I
I'm
you know
glad to have blown your mind.
I hadn't really considered that. I just figured, I've spent probably the last 4 years or ish, learning to program, and honestly, I've probably tried so many, like maybe a good 3/4 of the languages out there. Um,
Hmm.
I mean, maybe it's less, but it's been a lot, and I just hadn't really considered that. Maybe I rate myself so low because just I've learned a lot more. You know,
Hmm.
I hadn't really given that
Yeah,
I hadn't considered that.
yeah, and it can be both, right? Like we can be aware of our weaknesses and know that we want to improve them, and so that's good, right? Walk into the world with some humility about ourselves, but
Yeah.
also be aware. Like I had this quote um, from a mentor of mine, former boss, really, really excellent leader, and his comment about imposter syndrome was like, yeah, of course I'm an imposter, like of course, but it's not my job to decide that. It's not my job to decide whether or not I am qualified and capable for this position or whether or not I'm able to do it. It's my job to do my absolute best to live up to the responsibility and do what it is that I'm hired for. And it is someone else's job to decide whether or not I'm actually effective at that. And that was his kind of way of getting around imposter syndrome, was like, yeah, just accept it, of
Just
course.
accept it. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not your job to judge yourself.
Right.
It's, other people will do that for you.
Yeah. I mean, you get a job, and the company's going to decide whether, or you apply for something, and a company's going to decide whether you're good enough for it or not.
Hmm. Well, and so we're not going to talk about Elixir today at all because there's too much. There's too many interesting things to cover. We'll see how much we're able to get to. But I really want to talk about kind of related to this. So as much as I say other people are going to be your judges and you don't have to be your own judge, of course you're still going to like be critical of your abilities and use your knowledge of your strengths and weaknesses to know where to improve. Of course, there's a dichotomy here.
Right.
But I got to have a really interesting experience. So, one of the things that you might encounter if you're looking for work that I really hate, and I want to change the culture around this, is that some companies, if while they're ascertaining your ability, they find that wherever you are on the spectrum of ability is lower than their bar, whatever that means to them, right? Different companies will have different bars.
Right.
Some companies will be unfortunately judgmental and will not gracefully they won't speak to you in a way that I find respectful, right? It'll be this, you feel judged, you feel
Hmm.
like the people are being judgmental. It's kind of this like, oh, kind of vibe from the people in front of you. And of course, not everyone does that. There's lots of excellent interviewers,
Yeah,
but it's an unfortunate trend I've had the opportunity to experience. And I had the opportunity to experience it in a very unique way where when I started the Elixir Newbie podcast, more people started reaching out to me about how do I get my first job, which is where a lot of these thoughts come from. Um, and I was like, well, I've always done it in a kind of weird way where I've always known the person who was hiring me, right? I always kind of met them through mutual contacts, and it was kind of a friend hiring me. Like a good friend of mine gave me my first job, and then he helped me get my next job. And so
sure.
I was like, I don't feel like I'm the right person to answer this question because it's not coming from a place of experience. So I was like, okay, well, how do I get experience?
I need one of
And
those.
yes. Having friends, man, having a good support network is absolutely critical. But suffice it to say, I still wanted hands on experience of what's it like to look for work from scratch. And so I did this experiment. I was kind of in a position where I was like, you know what? I kind of am thinking about leaving, but not in a like immediate kind of a way. So let's just do a bunch
Yeah.
of job hunting. And I don't care about the outcome. Like, I am not concerned at all about actually getting a job. I'm doing this purely as an experiment for learning. So I'm going to purposely try things that I wouldn't normally try for fear that it would lose me the opportunity. And I learned a ton from that.
Oh wow,
Um,
that's interesting.
it was fun. It was very fun. One of the things I learned, because there's a few different stories in there. I won't have time to tell all of it, but one of the things I learned was so most interviews do what I call example based testing, right? This is just like if you're doing testing in a code system where you say, hey, call my function with this input, it should return this output, and then the function works. It's like, okay, I have a function that doubles numbers. If I give it 2, it should return 4. Cool. Have you actually comprehensively tested and understood your function? No, you've only tested it for one input, example based testing. And so that's how most companies do it. They give you a very small exercise and they say, do this exercise. And depending on how you do, we're going to judge your ability. So if we pick something that you've just never thought about before, too bad you're going to get under where you probably should land. Or if you literally just saw this problem, great, you're going to look like you're a senior dev, even though you're probably more junior or intermediate.
Ah,
And so what I had happen was in doing a few different interviews, I was rated all over the place. So in more conversational interviews, they said, yeah, you're like, you're like not quite senior, more like high intermediate, just peeking into the senior. You'd be a senior at most other companies, but because our domain is very specific, you're probably not going to feel like a senior here. That was kind of their response. So I was like,
hmm,
oh, okay, cool. Then
okay.
I went to another company and they told me, yeah, you're like barely intermediate. You're like a low intermediate dev, just above being a junior. And I was like, okay, interesting. And so that taught me like, don't, as much as other people are your judges, also like, don't let other people determine your value. If a company is judgmental, like sometimes it's because they have really bad hiring practices and they don't know how to actually find out people's skill.
Yeah,
Um,
I've kind of seen a lot of that on LinkedIn, and Twitter, uh, dev Twitter especially, complaining about the hiring practices and how they really don't reflect what you're going to do on the job. So a lot of times you wind up with these leak code program or tests that don't really
mhm.
they don't really measure your ability to do the job that they're hiring for, and just kind of a lot of that kind of stuff where
Mhm.
companies just have these really uh, off the rails hiring practices that don't really fit what they're hiring for, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Some of them can be pretty crazy. I once had an interviewer. This was so many different red flags here. We sat down. We had an hour-long meeting booked, and I was working a full-time job and was also interviewing at multiple different companies simultaneously, which means multiple code challenges and things that I'm doing. Take-home assignments. Normally, I don't like take-home assignments, but for the sake of kind of this experiment, I was willing to do them. Um, and he said, "Hey, like you're going to build a URL shortener." I'm like, what? Like, you want me to build a fully functioning URL? Like, you want me to talk through how I would build it, right? No, no. In the next 30 minutes, I want you to build a URL shortener. I'm like, that's too big, man. Like 30 minutes isn't even enough time for me to think. I've never seen
Yeah,
that domain.
that's
I need
crazy.
to think about the problem. That's going to require scaffing it out in an entire app. And
Right.
you want me to do that in the next 30 minutes? He's like, oh, yeah, no problem. You can stay late. No,
You can stay
no, I
late.
can't stay late.
Do
You
our
booked
work
this
for
for an
us. Thank
hour.
you.
Respect my time.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. So that was the company that told me that I was a junior dev.
Uh,
So I don't hold too much weight in that comment.
that's funny.
I might sound a little bit salty.
No, I mean, with good reason.
What's the
Especially
funny one? I
since they were basically wanting you to do some work for them and not get paid. Were they paying for this?
yeah, it's and again, I'm not actually trying to be salty. I more
Oh,
tell
I
that
know.
story because I know that a lot of newer devs get discouraged by the process, and I'm here to say like it's really not you. Like what is wrong about being inexperienced? Like fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Everyone
Right.
starts out beginner at some point.
Yeah.
Everyone has to work their way through. Okay, there's a few super geniuses out there who,
Sure.
move at a much faster pace, but ultimately we're all still walking the same line.
Hmm.
So what is there to be shameful about being earlier or later on in that climb up the mountain? Like there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. Yeah. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And that's probably part of um what discourages people um with the
Hmm.
job search.
Well, if you're junior, you think that people know what they're talking about, right? You assume that everyone else knows and you don't. And so
Sure.
if some other company says, "Oh, you're pretty inexperienced," or if they kind of make you feel judged, then you're going to take that like it's a comment that's worth some weight. But in
Hmm.
my opinion, if anyone makes someone feel bad because they're now, if you're misrepresenting yourself, this is a very different conversation.
Yeah.
But if you're honest about your abilities and yourself, then like, what's there to be ashamed of? You know?
Right. I mean, because the world of tech is wide and large, and you can only know so much of it at one time.
Hmm.
There's
Part of what I love about it is
yeah.
like you as an absolute beginner developer in 3 days, heck, in 20 minutes, could know more about something
Hmm.
than an experienced developer.
Sure.
There's too much to know. They've
Yeah.
never even been introduced to the concept. They'll have stronger fundamentals,
Yeah.
but if you've spent some time on something, then you'll know more about it.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Let's switch gears here for a minute. Um,
Yeah.
I
Let's talk
wanted,
about Elixir.
yeah, I was going to say I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about Elixir. Um, so it's a functional programming language. What's the difference between that
Correct.
and the standard object oriented?
I love that question. And it's a question that when I first started developing, I kept asking, and everyone gave me these like horrible, very confusing answers.
Hmm.
And I'm going to try my best to make it as clear and understandable as possible,
Yeah.
knowing full well that in order to really understand the difference, you kind of have to spend some time with both,
Sure.
and that'll give you more of an understanding.
Yeah.
But I'll start by saying so these are two problem solving tools, right? They're paradigms of thinking, they're ways of thinking about building programs that allow
Yep.
us to model and solve problems, right? Classic object oriented is saying everything in the world is an object, it has data and behavior. These things are grouped together, and we often call that a class or some kind of structure, right? So I have a cat and it has behavior where it can speak, it can say meow, right? And maybe it has some internal data associated with it, like its hair, fur color, age, And so that's object oriented. Is it's a way of modeling reality and problems by using objects, by grouping up data and behavior, right? And so functional programming says, hey, we don't agree with that way of modeling problems. There's some issues with that, right? Like object oriented inheritance is a huge problem. Where okay, well, we have a cat and a dog. We're going to say that these both have a common ancestor, a common, commonality. And we're going to call that an animal, right? And so all animals
Right.
can speak. And then we're going to implement those. It's been a little while since I might have my terminology wrong here because I haven't done object oriented in a while, but we're going to
Sure.
implement
Sure.
those
Yeah.
in our two child classes. But then you have things like, okay, but like, are they really common? Are they really going to have similar functions? Did we make the right ancestor? Did we make the right um, a kind of common class to group them together. Then you wind up with these massively complex inheritance trees, and it's not, um, for some problems, it's not the right way of solving the problem. It
Okay.
winds up having a bunch of issues. And so functional programming, it's not anything extra. Let me just say that. Functional programming is more like programming with additional limitations and constraints that make your program easier to follow and easier to understand. At least that's the goal of it, right? These are both, the goal of both of these paradigms is to make problems easier to solve, easier to understand. And so functional says, hey, object oriented programming, I don't like that you're grouping data and behavior together, right? You have a class, it has some internal data, some state, and you have functions, and often those functions will kind of mutate or modify the internal state of the class. I don't think that's right. I think that behavior and data should be separate. So instead, we have our data and we say, cool, we have a cat, right? And we have a concept specifically in Elixir called a struct, which stands for structure,
Okay.
which is a way of structuring data, right? It's basically just some enforcement around like a basic data type. So we might say, okay, I have a cat struct, and it has all the data associated with the cat, and then I'm going to have some function that accepts the cat. I'm going to have my speak function, my say function, whatever it is. And when I pass in the cat, I'm going to handle it differently than when you pass in a dog. So I'm also going to have a dog struct with all the information about a dog. And then when I pass that in, because it's a dog struct instead of a cat struct, it's going to say woof instead of meow, right? And so
Okay.
we have separated our data from our behavior. And
Hmm.
that is fundamentally how I think about the difference between functional and object oriented. Now, there's, of course, this, it's kind of like, what's the term? Universality? When you have very simple concepts that become massive, massive complex structures.
Right.
Um, and so it's kind of like, okay, well, that sounds simple on its head, but that means that object oriented has massively different patterns than something like functional. In functional programming, in certain functional paradigms, we don't allow mutation. And state is very explicit in functional programming. So in object oriented, um, I bet most people don't even realize that they're introducing state. So state being some variable
Sure.
that has some persistence, either in memory during runtime or like long-term persistence, like stored to a hard drive.
Mm-hmm.
And it has some value. So let's imagine like a counter, and we increment that counter, we mutate its state, and then cool, now the count has changed, right? But
Okay.
that type of mutation can result in all kinds of problems because okay, I have this variable that I'm relying on for the rest of my program. Everyone uses that count, it's an important value, and anyone can change it at the same time. And I need to track my changes to state because we're able to
Hmm.
just mutate that variable. And that introduces so many complex problems where, if you have two functions and somehow they're mutating a function outside of their scope, well, now you don't know what the value of that variable is anymore. And so as you use that variable lower down in your program, you haven't realized that it's been mutated. And that
Oh,
creates a huge problem,
interesting.
right? Most issues. So why is it that when you hit your TV, I don't know why I'm saying hit your TV. I'm thinking of the fawns for some reason. Why is it that when most technology goes wrong, the solution is to turn it off and on again, right? Classic,
Yeah,
have you
totally.
tried turning it off and on again?
Changing the state.
Right? State, because your program got into some kind of a bad state. That's 99% of programming issues. And so if you don't allow mutation,
It's 99%
you
of
don't.
cell phone issues, also, by the way.
Yes, all technology, right? If we have a bug on this podcast recording program, I guarantee you it's going to be because of state. And the way to solve that is by turning it off and on again. There's another thing related to that I'll talk about specifically in Elixir, but with regards to mutation, because we can't just mutate a value, we no longer run into the same kinds of state problems. There's still ways to introduce state into our application, but we have to be really explicit about it, and we wind up not relying on state when it doesn't actually need to be there.
Hmm.
So that's one huge difference.
Okay. Um. So one question I had was, in regards to the virtual machine that Elixir runs on.
Mhm.
Um. What what kind of makes it so special? I guess.
Yeah, so it was designed for fault tolerance and distribution. So it was designed to I was originally designed for kind of telephony systems where you need to have many, we sometimes call them a node, or you need to have many systems that if any single system breaks, it doesn't affect the rest of the system, right? So you can apply that to like a telephone call where if your connection drops, that shouldn't affect the rest of your callers. That would be really bad, right?
Oh
If
yeah,
a
yeah,
bug in one phone call affected another, oh, that's a huge problem. Another thing is we need it to be distributed. If all of the processing for this occurs synchronously, as opposed to in parallel or on a distributed system, which means we're doing many things at once,
right.
that's also a huge problem, right? If the processing for my phone call is delayed by yours, we have massive issues, right? And so it was designed to solve these types of problems, those of distributed systems and concurrency. So, concurrency meaning doing many things simultaneously, right? Concurrent,
Yep.
as opposed to synchronous, which, if you're a JavaScript dev or anything like that, all you've seen for the most part is probably synchronous code. And if you want to introduce concurrency, that's like it's an extra step.
Hmm.
It's really hard, it's not convenient. And so that is where kind of Erlang came in to solve those kinds of problems. And now those kinds of problems have become all kinds of problems. Like most systems are now distributed, and most systems need to horizontally scale, which means adding more machines in and distributing your load,
Hmm.
as opposed to vertically scaling, which is like, let's get a more powerful computer, right? There's limits to vertical scaling,
Right.
um, especially nowadays because the hardware is starting to hit its limits,
Yeah.
right? We're no longer getting free performance boosts. Now we're getting more. You're seeing a shift towards more cores in your machine, right? Multi-core processors are now becoming more normal, and so developers need to design for that. But most popular languages were not built with that type of concurrency in mind. They were built with, hey, my processor is going to be 2 times faster in 18 months or whatever Moore's law is exactly.
Yep.
Um, so I don't really need to worry about it. My program is going to be 2 times faster in a year or 18 months. I can't remember the specific number. Someone will correct me. I hope. Um, but it'll get faster for free. So like, great, things are just going to keep getting faster. I don't need to worry about it too much. Whatever algorithm I just wrote is going to be 2 times faster next year. But that's not a guarantee anymore. That's
Hmm.
not something we're seeing now. It's like, well, next year I bet I'm going to have more cores. I bet I'm going to be able to do better concurrency stuff.
Right.
And so that's where functional, especially, is really good for that type of, and Elixir especially actually, is really good for that type of distributed systems, that type of concurrency, which used to be more of a niche use case, but now I think is going to become the predominant use case. So right now, Elixir is small when compared with something like JavaScript.
Hmm.
I personally really, really believe it is in the prime position to be one of the most popular programming languages. Now, everyone knows how speculation and kind of these like predictions go. As most,
Sure.
I predict that most predictions are wrong, but as far as I can see, that makes sense for the kind of path of programming in the next 20 years or so.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What companies are using Elixir now? Do you know?
Well, Discord is probably one of the ones that a lot of people will recognize.
Okay.
And
Yep.
that's exactly the type of problem where you have multiple things happening
Hmm.
simultaneously, right? So, Discord, just in case people aren't aware, Discord it originally came out as kind of like a Slack for gamers.
Yeah.
So, it's a communication um, software. It allows you to do video call, text chat. If you've used Slack for work, it's basically like it offers really, really similar features as Slack. Um, it was originally marketed towards gamers. Now they've really shifted their marketing, and it's a much more just general use platform.
Hmm.
I kind of think of it as Slack but better, but
Yeah.
people don't use it for some reason. Um,
Yeah. Well, Slack is kind of a pain in the ass to get on. It's not. You
yes,
can't just like sign up and you got to be. I think you got to be invited, or you need to have. Um, I don't know if you got to be invited. I know last time I tried to get on Slack, it was not the easiest thing to do.
yeah, and Slack is a really good example of relational databases gone wrong. Not saying anything bad about relational databases, just when you pick the wrong relationship of your data,
Hmm.
because I think they did something like it's like each Slack They might have changed this. So if they did, like, good on them, because this is a hard problem to solve.
Right.
But they made it so that each Slack channel has their own user. And so you have a user dedicated to every, not channel, workspace. Is that what they call it? Basically, like
Yeah, I
if I
think it's
make a Slack
workspace.
for, hey, the Elixir Slack, right? Which, if people are interested in Elixir, there is an Elixir Slack that has a lot of really good conversations on there. Um, that is a separate user account, um, if I remember correctly. They might have fixed
Hmm.
that, but that was like one of the interesting problems around Slack. Anyway, I'm totally tangenting.
No, you're
Um,
fine.
so Discord is a great use case for something like Elixir because, okay, we have a chat, we have a video, we have multiple different channels, and all of these things need to run um, without affecting each other,
Right.
right? So
Yeah.
you asked earlier, what's one of the special things about kind of the Beam VM? So
Hmm.
the Beam VM has this really cool scheduling where every bit of your work gets a certain amount of time for execution. So if I'm doing two things simultaneously, let's say I'm doing something really expensive and something relatively cheap. So let's say I'm hosting my video, right? I'm streaming the video, and I'm also supporting a chat, right? The scheduling will receive the bits of work necessary, like taking the image, displaying it to the screen, um, and doing that for multiple different videos simultaneously, as well as receiving messages from the chat and displaying them to all of your users. It will, rather than allowing one to bottleneck the other, where like, oh, my video is really expensive, it's going to consume a lot of my CPU, and potentially make it so that, hey, like the chat is really laggy. Why did that happen?
Mm.
It's like, oh,
Hmm.
because the video feed is taking up too much of our resources and there's no resources left over for the chat. The scheduling is smart such that it'll take all of our bits of workload, spend a certain amount of time executing each, and then continuously swap between our different tasks that we have to do. So one of the cool examples of that is you can take, think of an algorithm that would run forever.
Yep.
Uh, it's going to take like 100 years before it finishes. If you start that in Elixir and you start it such that it can run concurrently, then it can continue running forever without actually bottlenecking and slowing down and stopping any of your other tasks that you're executing, any of your other bits of workload that you need to do, right? So you can be running that
Right.
thing that in most programs, if you started running that algorithm, it would crash your system because it would just go, hey, sorry, I'm going to run this forever now, and your whole screen would freeze.
Yeah.
um, with the scheduling system in the Beam, it wouldn't do that. It would spend a certain number of, I think it's measured in CPU cycles. I can't remember the specific word for it, but it would spend a super, super small amount of time working on that. Then it
Right.
would work on the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And then it would spend another bit of time working on that. And then the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. So it could continue running that really expensive task kind of infinitely,
Sure.
and the rest of your system wouldn't crash.
Okay. All right. All right. So as far as like, all right. So I know you're building a boot camp. Is that right? You're building a Elixir boot camp
Yeah. Yeah. So we call it an academy. I
academy.
don't know
Okay.
what the difference between an academy and a boot camp is, but we call it an academy.
I mean, I
Um,
assume an academy could maybe stretch longer than a boot camp. I don't know. Usually the boot camps are
yes.
like, short term, but I mean, I don't know. I don't know what your plans are with it.
Yeah, so I can give you the kind of overview. So it's called DockYard Academy. This is a 3 month full time course that people can apply to. We haven't launched yet, but we are accepting kind of people to say that they're interested. So we
Okay.
have, I can maybe put a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Um, and yeah, so 3 month full time, learn about Elixir. You walk through kind of the understanding of Elixir syntax and kind of the basics, solving problems. We go to project development with a tool called Mix. Um, and then we also talk about web development with a framework called Phoenix. We
Okay.
talk about some styling and CSS with another kind of CSS utility framework called Tailwind, which is really popular in the Elixir community.
Okay.
And then we also cover this concept called OTP,
Mm.
which is the acronym is rooted deeply in the history of how these things came to be. So it doesn't mean a lot. It's open telecom platform. What it really means is there's a bunch of tools related to distributed systems, concurrency, all the stuff that I've already talked about that are collectively grouped under what we call OTP in Elixir. And so this is all of our curriculum for the course is completely free and open source. The instructor-led training that people sign up for, that will be, full time with me, that's obviously a paid program. I don't have information yet about cost, but I anticipate that our first cohort is going to be heavily discounted, so people can kind of stay in the loop with that if they sign up.
Sure.
Um, and what else did I want to say? I was thinking about something, and then my brain kind of went a million different directions
So this
as it
is.
can do. Right. So
Oh, go ahead.
oh, I just want to mention. So yeah, the curriculum is completely open source. It's in beta. It's still a work in progress. So some of the content is not yet completed, but I'm constantly working through it. So people can kind of learn through Elixir by walking through that at their own self-led pace. That's a resource that is free, will always be free, and is like the backbone of how we're going to teach the course. Um, and yeah, so that's DockYard Academy. I think that's all of my important
What is
bits and bobs.
Dockyard?
Yeah, so DockYard is a consulting agency.
Okay.
They are big in the Elixir space.
Okay.
So we were one of the platinum sponsors for Elixir Conf 2022 this year, which just passed. That was a few weeks ago.
Oh, nice.
Um, it's kind of funny. DockYard was actually my dream company. I had a friend ask me while I was kind of going through this tumultuous time, like, "Hey, what do I want to do next?"
Hmm.
They asked, like, "Hey, like, what's your 5 year plan? Like, where do you see yourself in 5 years?" It's like, you know what? I would love to be working for either DockYard or Smart Logic is another really awesome company in the space that I mentioned. I'd love to be working for one of those two companies, kind of like 5 years down the line. And then 3 months later, I was working for
Oh, wow, that's crazy.
DockYard. So the timeline was definitely accelerated.
Ah,
But yeah, they have like, if you want a prime, it's weird because these are things I would say even when I wasn't working at Dockyard, so it feels weird to like say it on behalf of Dockyard because now
right.
it lands differently when you represent the company.
Sure.
So that's too bad, but I still believe these things, so I'm going to say them. One of the best examples of company culture, especially remote company culture, that I've ever seen. Like you could do case studies on how Dockyard manages their teams, manages remote work. They were working remotely before everyone was, and everyone had to. So they already kind of had it figured out. And yeah, I
Hmm.
love Dockyard, but they do consulting. So when people want expertise in Elixir, we also do some Ruby and Ruby on Rails stuff. Um, they go to Dockyard.
Okay. All right. Cool. And in case we didn't mention it, one of the cool things about Elixir is it actually has Ruby. It uses Ruby syntax. Is that right?
So it
Ruby
looks a
like.
lot like Ruby
Yeah.
syntax. It's definitely Ruby-like. So the creator Jose Valim came from the Ruby community, so he was inspired by the same principles of having English-like code that reads like it's spoken English, and has done his best, and the community has done their best to
Hmm.
uh, maintain readability. We're all about explicitness. That's one thing I think that Ruby and Elixir really differ in is
Okay.
Ruby has a lot of kind of magic
Sure.
in it where it's like I don't really know how this is working, but it's abstracted a lot for me, so it's convenient.
That's true.
It's conventional, and I don't actually know how it works. So if I need to like debug it, that becomes kind of hard to understand how the whole system is working.
Right.
Whereas Elixir took a lot of Ruby like syntax, where if you're coming from Ruby, it's going to feel familiar. There will definitely be some things that do trip you up, like mutation is one of those common ones where hey, like
Mm.
I just redefined rebound this variable. Why is it not changed? It's like, well, because you can't mutate it. Um, you can't call a function, rebind the variable,
Mm.
and have it changed outside of the scope of that function. You're not allowed to do that.
Oh.
So there will be some things that will trip people up, of course, if you're coming from object oriented, but it is designed with um, readability and developer experience in mind. It has tons of really awesome tools. Like one of the coolest things that I fell in love with, because I'm someone who really loves testing, is it has a built-in testing framework called XUnit. The tests are really, really clean. I think it's one of the cleanest frameworks I've ever seen. The test output, because of the nature of Elixir, it's able to give you quite a lot of information about your test failures. So Elixir, there's something called the AST, which is an abstract syntax tree. It's essentially the way that Elixir is represented under the hood. And so when you are calling a function, let's say you're giving it a variable. So you bind a variable to the number two. Um, well, let's say maybe a more complex. You bind a variable to a map, which is kind of like an object in JavaScript, a key value data structure, and then you pass that to a function. So Elixir doesn't just have the value you passed in, it's also able to understand information about what you passed in. Like it can know if you passed in a function, it'll know the name of the function and some information about it. It can know quite a lot because of the abstract syntax tree that it uses to represent under the hood. And so instead of just saying, hey, like we thought, assert true kind of a thing, like um, this test was supposed to return truthy, it returned falsy. It can give you really specific information about, like, hey, you said that 2 was supposed to be equal to 4. It's not. Here's the difference between them. This map was supposed to be equal to this map. It's not. Here's the exact key value differences between them. So as far as testing goes, it's beautiful. I love XUnit.
Oh wow. Okay. Let's see here. I kind of scribbled some questions down, but I think we've been covering most of it. So
You,
go ahead.
I just want to say I'm kind of the type of person
Yeah.
who I'm like a wind up toy.
Yeah, yeah.
If you wind me up and get me going on a subject, I will kind of talk forever.
No, that's fine.
Um,
That's actually fun. It makes it a lot more fun. Because then I don't have to worry about uh, kind of scripting everything out. Usually, I just try to ask questions based on what we're talking about, or that kind of
mhm,
thing. But if I have anything specific, I kind of scribbled it down. Like, you had a guy on your podcast.
yeah.
I think his name Daniel. I could be completely wrong. He was
Can you tell me what the subject
yeah, yeah,
was?
yeah. So he was looking for his first job, and he had decided to jump into Elixir.
Oh,
And
Matthew Baker.
Matthew. I don't know
He's
why
a
I
good
thought.
friend of mine. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, funny enough, I had him on the podcast
right.
because he reached out and said, "Hey, like I enjoy Elixir Newbie.
Hmm.
I'm looking for my first dev job," and that led to me asking, "Hey, like, do you want to come on? That'd be perfect." And him and I are now like very good friends. We play Dungeons and Dragons every week.
Oh,
Um,
nice. Sounds like fun.
yeah. So if you want to be on my podcast, just send me a message,
Fair enough.
and then we'll play Dungeons and Dragons together. I think
Sweet.
that's kind of
On the
how the path
podcast.
goes. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
funny.
Sorry. Did you have
Yeah, I
a
was.
question about Matthew?
Yeah, no, not an issue. I just was curious how his job hunt went and where he landed and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So I'm so sad. Him and I recorded a follow-up episode
Oh, he did.
celebrating that he found his job and he's been working there for a while.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I'm going to probably have to re-record when I have some time
Okay.
because we had an audio issue and I had to throw away the audio.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
Yeah, it had like a double echo thing and his mic
Uh-huh.
was also picking up my sound and
Oh, that's terrible.
um,
Yeah,
oh, it's heartbreaking.
I've got a friend that I've tried to bring on a couple. He always winds up with some kind of weird audio issue, and
That's a bummer.
this and even in like all the stuff that I've tried, including some software that's AI driven, couldn't pull the high pitched whine out of his audio, and it was too much, and the high pitched whine was annoying to listen to, so I just scrapped
Yeah.
it. And I've tried to record a
Yeah.
couple more times, and just hasn't worked out.
The
But
secret of content creation, you lose a lot of it. What people see
yeah,
is only a small part of what is actually made.
yeah, that's so true. I do like the fact that um, using something like Zencaster holds your audio for you. So if you need to download it again at any point, you can. Um,
Mhm.
and I did need to at some point because somebody on Twitter graciously gave me this Mac Mini that I'm using, um,
Nice.
and it's um, I had issues because Apple does a lot of weird stuff, and you resetting your Apple ID is really hard. And it's funny because I used to work as a cell phone salesman, and so I used to troubleshoot people's iPhones and Apple IDs and all this stuff all the time. I mean, and so I knew better. I knew that if I set up an Apple ID, I had to write everything down
Mhm.
and on paper and put it somewhere physical where I could get at it and, remember where it was. And when I made my Apple ID for this, I'm just like, I'll remember it, blah blah blah, and uh, lost
Yep.
lost the password. Couldn't get back into it,
Yep.
and then I wound
Yeah.
up, yeah, I had to jump through a bunch of hoops to get back into the computer. So I had wiped it, which included whatever audio I had recorded at the time. But fortunately, it was still on Zencaster, so I was able to re-download it. Um,
Yeah, the secret to making sure that you never lose anything is have everything backed up somewhere on a cloud.
yeah.
Um, and also, I keep everything in GitHub.
Oh,
Literally everything,
nice.
even like personal notes, I
Oh,
keep it in GitHub,
uh,
whether it's public or private.
interesting.
So I could destroy my computer right now,
Yeah.
and I would just be out money. Like that's the only disappointment there'd be. I would be fine with my data. I'd have it all somewhere. Maybe I would lose some like local Git changes if I hadn't committed and pushed something up. That is like the worst thing that will happen. So,
Oh, wow.
um, very important. If you're a programmer, make sure that if your computer catches fire
Yeah.
or dies, that you're okay. Like that is a security thing that you should be considering. Is computers just suddenly die? Um,
Yes, they do.
that happens. They break, and so if you have anything that you'd be scared to lose, have a system for that. Whatever it is, if it's a backup, I hate doing like manual backups. Plus, they're kind of unreliable.
Hmm.
Plus, they can break.
Right.
So I much preferred any kind of cloud system that just automates these things, having everything in OneDrive or whatever it is, using things like the Google Suite, like Google Docs,
Hmm.
Google Slides,
Yeah, I use
instead of
Docs a
local
lot.
programs. Yeah, whatever it is. All right, um,
Cool.
man, we have gone all over the board
Yeah,
with
that's
our
that makes for a
subjects
great
today.
title.
Yeah,
have
it's
you
gonna be
have you
like
seen my
20
titles?
keywords long.
They're all just like random stuff pulled from each episode. It's kind of funny. Um,
Too funny.
I wanted. Oh yeah. So for someone trying to get started. Oh, I know what it was. You were talking about wanting to make Elixir like a first language um, kind of thing on your
Hmm.
podcast.
Yeah.
What are your kind of thoughts on Elixir as a first language for somebody?
Yeah, so I think there's some things fighting against that right now.
Hmm.
Some unfortunate realities, which are functional programming has terrible branding.
Yes.
So I bet that if anyone listening to this has heard of functional programming and hasn't actually tried it yet,
Hmm.
their opinion or what they've heard is that it's kind of hard,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
it has bad branding. People think, oh, it's really math heavy. It's only for, really mathematical stuff, which like just isn't true at all. So it has horrible branding, and people have been kind of misrepresenting it, in my opinion, at least. And so I think there's that. There's the perception of functional is hard, and so it doesn't attract beginners.
Right.
And then there's just inertia and momentum, right? Like if you want to get a job, you intuitively think, okay, I should use the most popular language. Um, right? That often means JavaScript.
Sure.
And so my kind of counter to that is if you're looking for a job, what really matters is not the number of jobs out there. What matters is the ratio of developers to jobs,
Mm.
right? So
Hmm.
take some simple math, right? If I am one of 100 developers applying to 10 jobs, that's hard, right? You scale that up and say, oh well, it's actually 10,000 jobs and 100,000 developers, whatever. For the sake of simple math, let's say 110, right? That means that 90 people are not going to have jobs, and so even though I picked the one that had maybe more, so let's say that's JavaScript. When I say Elixir, there are 5 jobs instead of 10, but now there's only 20 developers, right?
Hmm.
As far as
Okay.
your ratio goes. So Elixir right now in particular, there is a huge hiring demand. Like we need developers. It's one of the biggest complaints in the space by companies right now is I need more people to hire. And so huge demand. And it's much easier, in my opinion, to stand out as an Elixir developer because we just celebrated our 10th year anniversary. So that means that most people are not going to have, it's impossible to have more than 10 years of experience, and most people are not going to have more than 5. Um, and so, if you have any real Elixir experience, you're suddenly much more of a standout. Like finding out, oh, you have a year or two of Elixir experience is much more impressive than, oh, you have a year or two of JavaScript experience. It's like that's
Mm.
almost a minimum on most
Yeah.
entry level jobs somehow these days, right?
Right.
Everyone's
Yeah.
seeing the
You need
job
like 20
postings.
years of JavaScript experience and
Yeah.
15
Yeah, it's
frameworks.
horrible. It's completely horrible. Um, uh, but yeah, so I think that so that's the hiring piece of it, right? Is I think
Mhm.
that people are scared to get into Elixir because they're concerned about work, and what I've seen is that there's actually quite a lot of work. The people that I've tried to help get into Elixir have been able to find work.
Mhm.
Um, DockYard Academy is going to be really connected to the industry, so that's going to be a great way to kind of grow people into the language and help them find work afterwards.
So,
So I think that finding a job is
so
sorry, go
your
ahead.
boot camp will be giving some sort of support for getting work, getting
Yeah.
jobs?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's going to be a possibility. So we can't make guarantees,
Sure. Yeah.
but
Of
there is
course
going
not.
to be a possibility of being placed with Dockyard. So that's one of the nice things about having this started by a company who does Elixir
Oh,
consulting
that's fair.
is like we are also hiring. And so there's a great, that's a great opportunity for some people to potentially be placed within hiring programs at Dockyard. We're going to be ready to kind of receive new developers and help them ease into the industry.
Okay.
We also have hiring partners, so people we know in the community that we can help people reach out to. Because Dockyard is a big player in the Elixir space, there's going to be lots of people. Like I talked to our people responsible for hiring, and they've already had companies reach up and say, like, "Hey, like, can we hire people from you? Like, how does that going to work?"
Mm.
And so I think there's a huge opportunity there on the hiring front.
Oh, wow.
Um, and then the other is learning, right? So getting a
Sure.
job is one of the factors involved with picking your first language. If that's your priority, which for most people it's going to be, then you want to know that you can get a job. And so right now, a lot of people concerned, oh, Elixir's smaller. I don't think it'll be as easy to get a job. I think that is just bad branding again. And I think
Right.
that the reality of the story is that actually, I think it is. I don't know easier or harder,
Hmm.
but I will say it is very, very possible to get a job within Elixir. Like you can find Elixir work. There's lots of work out there, and there's fewer developers looking for it, so you have a better ratio of people applying for these jobs.
Yeah, you'd probably have
So
better
that's going to make it easier.
visibility if you were applying
Exactly.
for
Right.
this. Okay. Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of
Like
sense.
I mean, if I had started a JavaScript podcast, I don't think that anyone would really have noticed. Right. It would have been
Hmm.
like the 200th JavaScript podcast.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Um, But in Elixir, I think I'm probably like the somewhere between the fourth and the eighth Elixir podcast.
Okay, yeah.
Um, and
Yeah, I saw a
so
couple
by
other
the
ones,
fact
but
that
they
I,
were, I think yours was the only one I saw that was sort of on the newbie spectrum.
yeah,
Um,
I picked newbie
I think that was
specifically
smart.
because I was a newbie when I still I like to walk in with beginner mindset still, but I
Hmm.
literally
Hmm.
started a podcast being an absolute brand new developer in Elixir. Like I had been a developer, but Elixir was new to me.
Right.
And so that was my way of saying, "Hey, I don't know what I'm talking about. So if I say anything wrong,
Don't
don't
shoot
get mad."
me.
But yeah, so there's opportunities there. Now, I also want to say from a learning perspective, what I've seen is that functional programming seems to fit better with how most people think about learning. Uh, most people think about programming kind of out of the box. Like we force object oriented programming into people's heads and
Mm-hmm.
make them think about the world in this like way that in my opinion just doesn't match how reality works,
Right.
whereas
Everything's an
functional seems
object.
to, yeah, like the people who struggle with functional, like new developers learning functional seem to really pick it up, and it's just kind of like they learn because it's what they're seeing, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Where I see struggle is often unlearning object oriented,
Hmm.
is that's where the struggle is like, hey, like why can't I just have a for loop, put a variable outside of the for loop and then mutate it in order to return my output? It's like, well, because we don't do that. We don't do mutation. And so suddenly there's a lot of problems that you could solve one way that you want to force your previously working solution. And you kind of need to learn the idiomatic Elixir way, functional way of doing it. But for people who are coming into it for the first time, there's this awesome talk, which I hope will be put up on YouTube. ElixirConf just happened, and then the recordings for ElixirConf
Yeah.
get uploaded, kind of weeks later. I don't know when they'll be out.
Okay.
Um, but there was an awesome talk by someone named Kimberly Bricks, and she told her story of how she went from a self-taught developer to her first Elixir job, and so Elixir is her first like professional language, and that's super cool to see.
Oh yeah, that'll be
She got
great.
to Yeah, so I highly recommend that talk if you want. It's definitely more of like a personal story,
Hmm.
kind of a talk rather than something like technical about how to learn Elixir. But if you're
Sure.
just looking for something kind of inspiring, I really loved. I thought her story and seeing that more people are getting into it from scratch was super inspiring.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people that might be listening, including myself, looking for those kind of maybe anecdotal, or if I said the wrong word, I'm not sure, but
Anecdotal.
just yeah, anecdotal. Just those kind of stories about people getting into the industry for the first time are definitely inspiring, and um, something to watch or listen to. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, hundred
That's why I
percent.
liked your conversation with Matthew. Um, that was actually one of my favorite episodes.
Me too. Yeah, I'm glad I've because there's some podcasts in the Elixir space that are much more like Elixir expertise,
Hmm.
right? And so when they have people on, they need to talk about really highly technical subjects.
Yeah. When
I
first
have the freedom.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was gonna say
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
when I first started listening to Elixir podcasts, I was kind of like just kind of checking them out. So I listened to an episode here and there of whatever there was. Yeah, they were all like really way over my head, and I was like, yeah, okay, I'm gonna find something less technical.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming, right? And those
Yeah.
are, by the way, outstanding podcasts.
Oh,
If
yeah,
you
yeah.
are capable of following along, that's what you want, right? I don't want to have to wait while someone explains what a gen server is to me. And I'm purposely not going to explain that to kind of demonstrate my point. Um, because that would be a whole explanation in and of itself.
Yeah.
But I don't want to have to rehash that explanation if I'm listening to an expertise podcast, which is where I saw there was an opportunity in the beginner space, which I love because yeah, I can have anyone on. Like I can have people from non-Elixir spaces.
Right.
Um, it really opens up the doors there.
Yeah. Most definitely.
Yeah, I know we're kind of getting to what I think is probably the tail end of
Yeah.
the time that we have. So I did just
Hmm.
want to mention for anyone who is wanting to learn more about Elixir, I'm happy to give like I give kind of coaching advice, hiring advice. I'm always happy to talk to people and respond to them on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way to kind of get a hold of me. There's also other things like LinkedIn if you want to do that, but I'm at Brooklyn J Myers on Twitter. So if anyone is wanting to learn more about Elixir or wants to talk about, hey, like how can I get into this? My messages are always open. I'm always happy to talk to people who are just interested in exploring the space. And yeah, of course, I already mentioned it, but if people are interested in beta testing the academy, I do free coaching and training as part of that, or I should just say teaching. So 3 to 4 times a week, I do 1 to 2 hour sessions where it's either an open support time where people can just ask questions about kind of the curriculum or just any Elixir stuff that they've been working on. Or I also do typically Monday night teaching time where I will teach about some kind of Elixir concept. Again, all of that is free. None of that is paid. That's all. If you send me a message on Twitter and say, "Hey, I'm really interested in beta testing the curriculum," then I will get you on there, and you can join our Discord where we have a whole community of mentors and awesome folks who can help you learn Elixir.
Sounds perfect, man. Thanks a lot for coming on and talking to me today. I really appreciate it. It's been a blast.
Yeah, this is super fun. We wound up going way over, I think, our initial recording time. I hope you're going to have fun editing this.
Oh yeah, it's gonna
Um,
that's always a fun. Chopping it up is always a good time.
yeah, no doubt. This is why I don't edit. I just cut out the dead silences, and that is all the editing that I do.
Yeah, and the PHP Ugly guys, that's pretty much all they do too. I think they stream their episodes now on
Oh,
YouTube, and
cool.
then they run it through a couple of uh, programs to fix audio and that kind of stuff, and then just shoot it out.
Yeah,
I still take a kind of
keep it
a
easy.
heavier hand to the editing, just still learning my workflow, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
process. Eventually, like I got to the point where the podcast was a thing I had a whole day to spend on, and now it's a thing that I have like minutes
Right, exactly.
to spend
Which I'm
on.
I'm kind of getting there.
Yeah.
I tend to I try to listen through each episode just to kind of cover my butt.
Yep.
Um, like this episode, I'm actually in the middle of editing now. I'm not really cutting much. I'm just kind of you know one of the speakers had a lot of background noise because of where he's located. Um,
Mm,
he's in Kenya, and so his
yeah.
he had to basically book a week in advance to be able to get on the podcast with a internet cafe.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a little bit challenging there, but so he had some background noise.
It's tough.
So I just try to cut where I can and leave some of it in, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the remote world has made a lot of people need to, yeah, it's tough. I feel for people who have a hard time getting a nice background,
Hmm.
whether that's visual, whether that's just background noise. Like, it has created kind of a new class system, um in, like, I think the truest sense of the word, where if you have that opportunity, that is like a very strong advantage that you used to not need because we just had offices. So
Yeah,
it's,
yeah.
I love remote work, but it's good to be aware of the negatives that we need to like overcome and figure out how can we make it easier for people to, you know, have a background or have something that won't have tons of noise.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for coming on, and I will maybe I'll hit you up on Twitter. I've got a couple other things I want to ask you.
Absolutely. Feel free to reach out anytime. Thanks so much for
All
having me.
right, thanks. Take it easy. You've been listening to episode 5 of the Citizen Coder podcast. If you'd like to follow Brooklyn, you can find him on Twitter. Link is in the show notes. If you're interested in Elixir programming or would like to know more, or if you're interested in trying out the DockYard Academy curriculum, check the show notes for more information. You can follow me on Twitter, LinkedIn, or YouTube, and as always, I'll see you next time.